Hi, Dr. Hetchy. My name is Michael Eulis, and my group members are Caroline Pitts and Leah Rhodes. For our project, we chose to watch and analyze the film American History X, which stars Edward Norton and Edward Furlong and is directed by Tony Kaye. The plot of the movie is centered around Derek Vineyard, a neo-Nazi skinhead and leader of a white supremacist gang that's living a life of racism and anger. His lifestyle finally catches up with him as he murders two Black men in a fit of rage that were trying to steal his car. He gets arrested and goes to prison for 3 years, which would have been a life sentence had his brother Danny not testified on his behalf. He reaches a turning point in prison as he befriends a Black inmate named Lamont and is assaulted and outcast by his fellow neo-Nazis. He comes out of prison reformed and realizes that Danny is following his footsteps, which makes him determined to prevent him from going down the same path. The film is narrated and seen through the eyes of Danny and shows Derek struggling with his own deeply ingrained prejudices as he wonders if his family can overcome a lifetime of hate and discrimination.
White supremacy in America has had a long and complicated history. It is theorized that it was solidified in our nation's history when the Constitution was written and published. The Constitution stated that the African American slaves were only to be considered as 3/5 of a person, which increased the political power of slaveholding states because of the implications this had on congressional representation. The Civil War was fought to end the status of slavery, but those living in previous slaveholding states did not change their hateful and oppressive opinions. As white supremacy grew stronger, as African Americans and other people of color were beginning to gain more rights, which led to the uprising of violent groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. The KKK not only targeted people of color, but those with opposing religious beliefs such as Catholicism and Judaism. These groups continued to gain political support and were very popular among Caucasian men and women during the era of Jim Crow up till its end in 1965. Many white Americans became hostile towards the government due to the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s. These movements led to great improvements for racial groups, which included affirmative action and rules against racial discrimination. This made even more white groups upset, and it led to these groups doubling down on their beliefs, which created more hateful subgroups such as neo-Nazi organizations.
These are some of the major themes in the movie. Racism and bigotry are portrayed heavily throughout by the characters' actions and dialogue. We see it with Derek and the skinhead gang against any non-whites, and it begins to affect his brother Danny as well. Another theme is the consequences and pointlessness of hatred as we see the impact hate has on the characters in the movie and how it affects them. The picture on the right shows an example of this as we see Danny was killed despite being reformed due to his earlier actions based on hate. Also, Derek was sent to prison and his dad was murdered as consequences of their hatred. Another theme is transformation and the struggle to change, which is seen through Derek's character in the movie as he realizes that hate is pointless and that it is hurting and corrupting his family. We see that Derek struggles with his own deeply held beliefs and motives as he tries to convince Danny not to follow his footsteps. Another theme is family ties and influence, which is portrayed through Danny's eyes as we see the influence Derek has had on him, as he both convinced him to join the skinheads, as well as was also able to convince him to leave racism behind after he got out of prison. It's also seen through Derek's racist dad influencing Derek. Self-determinism is another theme in the film as Derek realizes that he is in control of his own path and his own life, which he realizes after his talk with his teacher Sweeney in prison, when Sweeney asks him if anything he has done has made his life better. Lastly, the theme of rage and violence is big in the film as it emphasizes how rage can overtake someone and lead them to make horrible decisions, which is seen when Derek kills the Black man in brutal fashion in this picture on the right.
While we know that racism is wrong in any capacity, there are answers as to why on a philosophical level. All academics find racism to be immoral due to the negative impacts on society. These reasons include that racism corrupts the people and institutions it infects, and in turn ends up breeding more racism from those who are influenced. Racism also leads to people being treated as if they were inferior through a lack of respect. Being treated with dignity and kindness is a basic human right, so anyone treating someone with prejudice and intolerance is infringing upon those rights. Additionally, racism leads to harsh consequences and a lack of agreeable solutions. Our thesis is through Danny's narration in American History X, we see that racism is morally wrong because it corrupts the people it infects and breeds more racism, which is seen as it passed down through each generation in Danny's family and influenced all of Cameron's followers to join the white supremacist gang. It also treats people as fundamentally inferior and lacking respect, which is emphasized by Kantian theory and virtue ethics, as shown by many characters' harsh actions and words in the movie. Lastly, it leads to harsh consequences and no resolutions, which is seen through Derek's rage and violence overtaking him and Danny's death at the end.
The first part of our argument is that racism corrupts the institutions and people it comes into contact with. This is supported throughout Garcia's paper, The Heart of Racism, as he says that racism isn't about beliefs and actions, but rather the intentions and motives that drive the person's actions, and that it stems from racial disaffection. He also explains how racism corrupts the people, actions, and institutions that it comes into contact with, which directly supports our point about how racism breeds more racism. He emphasizes that widespread racism starts with an individual and then corrupts other individuals, and that it spreads easily and will influence people's behavior. Here are some moments from American History X to demonstrate how racism is able to corrupt people. On the bottom right, Derek and Danny's father is ranting to them about affirmative action. Although it's portrayed more subtly, he's making sure that Derek sees an issue with things that provide no direct benefit for white people. Over time, his dad's rhetoric has latched on to Derek. Later, he meets the man in the top right, Cameron, who further indoctrinates him in more conspicuous ways, and eventually they work together to lead their local gang of neo-Nazis. After his prison sentence is complete, Derek returns home to find that Danny has shaved his head like the others in the gang. It upsets Derek because now that he has reached some level of reformation, he's realizing what he's gotten his brother into and how he's influenced him to go down the same dark path.
The second point of our major argument is that the act of racism involves treating people as fundamentally inferior and disrespects a person's dignity, which is morally wrong. There are several points that support this. The first point includes virtue ethics. This idea is centered around the Greek term eudaimonia, meaning happiness or welfare. This means that a person has the right to live their best possible life, which would include possessing virtuous character traits. However, the act of racism involves infringing on someone's life through showing hatred or contempt for that person. This directly contradicts the way that someone should live according to this argument, as someone should live with virtuous ethics, while someone who is racist would possess morally adverse characteristic traits. Additionally, Garcia states that racism is, quote, an offense against virtues of benevolence and justice and deprives people of respect and goodwill that is owed to them, end quote. This quote explains that racism strips people of their respect and goodwill and that they deserve this as a basic human right. And finally, Kantian theory explains, quote, dignity grants every person a fundamental equal moral status. To treat anyone as being fundamentally inferior to others is to disrespect that person's dignity and thus to violate the duty of equal respect, end quote. Here we see that Kantian theory defines dignity as a fundamental equal right, and that by treating people in a way that deems them inferior violates that right. Racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance are for these reasons immoral. Here's some more examples from the movie showing how racist ideologies and actions disregard the rights and dignities of others. On the top left, Danny is seen blowing smoke in a black classmate's face in the school bathroom. The classmate is dehumanized in Danny's eyes and is a pretty direct example of what we mean by disregarding other people's dignity. Below is part of the scene where the neo-Nazi Seth is taunting Danny to repeat the doctrines of the gang. Danny says, quote, I hate anyone that isn't a white Protestant. They're a burden to the advancements of the white race, but some of them are all right, I guess, end quote. Seth's response in the picture further shows that even if he knows nothing about someone, that the person is automatically and fundamentally inferior to him because they're not a white Protestant. Lastly, on the right, you can see Derek playing basketball with a black man. It seems all right enough, But the context is that if the neo-Nazi gang wins, Black people will no longer be able to play on that basketball court. It's an example of white nationalists trying to re-implement Jim Crow-era segregation by completely disregarding the rights of non-whites.
Point 3 is that racism leads to harsh consequences and a lack of agreeable solutions. Some examples of these harsh consequences include interpersonal violence, hate crimes, and exclusion. These actions are motivated by feelings of superiority, tension, fear, and hatred, reflecting the motivations discussed by Garcia in The Heart of Racism. They are also indicative of dangerously immoral maxims and categorical imperatives. For example, someone with a maxim of racial superiority would likely be able to gain a categorical imperative to exclude and/or harm non-whites in order to maintain racial purity in their community. The racist believes this response is rational, although Kant argues that it's not a universal truth, so it cannot be justifiable. The solutions are difficult to achieve, mostly because it requires everyone to be on the same page. You can imagine when many people and systems operate on a maxim of superiority, then it would be difficult for them to achieve a higher level of respect for the dignity of people of color. Institutional structures would also have to gain a higher respect considering their influence over many different populations. Similarly, achieving solutions is difficult because there has to be acknowledgement of our own internalized biases and also recognizing modern systemic oppression. Here are some examples of Derek's consequences of racism that are seen in the movie. He was arrested after killing 2 Black men who were trying to steal his car. And we know this is racially motivated because of the sheer brutality of the murder and also the slurs Derek used. His arrest and conviction is a negative consequence for him, but as viewers, we see it as a form of justice. In prison, Derek is sexually assaulted in the showers by the Aryan Brotherhood, the group of skinheads that he abandoned earlier in the movie. This is a turning point for Derek and the catalyst for his reformation going forward. He is released from prison and tries to reform Danny, but despite this, Danny is shot and killed by a Black classmate who he antagonized earlier in the movie. This is the ultimate consequence for Derek as he realized his influence of racist ideology and neo-Nazism led to his brother's death, and his reformation ultimately led to no positive resolution for him or his brother. So in conclusion, we talked about the concepts of virtue ethics, Kantian ethics, as well as Garcia's ethical perspective through the lens of racism. And this has all allowed us to understand the philosophical approach to morality and character, apply these understandings to racism as a moral issue, and thus concluding that racist beliefs and actions are fundamentally immoral. A major aspect of this being that these beliefs and actions contradict the ethics previously discussed in the presentation, such as virtues and eudaimonia. As a film, the writing and imagery in American History X is fantastic at exemplifying how racism corrupts the people and institutions it comes into contact with around us, devalues the rights and dignities of non-whites, and generates harmful consequences, including but not limited to interpersonal violence and exclusion on both individual and systemic levels.